This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I am talking with an independent candidate for American president in 2020. His name is Mark Charles. He is a Native American, and he is the first of what I hope to be a series of interviews with third-party and independent candidates, and the conversation will start when we return. Mark Charles is my guest. He is an independent candidate running for the office of United States President in the year 2020. Mark, welcome. I like to give people a few minutes to introduce themselves, but I do want to talk about one thing since you are a Native American and American Indian, and we're here in the midst of this corona pandemic that's sweeping the world. But there is other news going on, and I caught news of something that came in the news just in the last 24 hours, and I wanted to get your opinion on it before we get too deep and I forget about it. And that is that there was a news story that the Secretary of the Interior of the United States just stated in the last 24 hours that they want to disestablish the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe in Massachusetts. I don't know if you heard about that, and if you had any thoughts or comments about that as you know, an American citizen and also as a Native American.
Well, thank you, Dan, for the introduction. Let me introduce myself traditionally. So,
Okay.
Mark Charles, yeah. Sinbakadan Nishla, the Tohiglini Basis Chin. Sinbakadan Dashache, the Tochini Dashanella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our four clans. We're matrilineal as a people with our identities coming from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Sinbakadan. Translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Sinbakadan. And my fourth clan, my father's father, is Totochitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I'm talking to you today from the lands that were once inhabited by the Piscataway. Now, today, it's known as Washington, D.C., but the Piscataway were the original inhabitants of this land. They were the host people of these lands. And I want to acknowledge them for the centuries they've spent stewarding these lands. And I want to acknowledge that these lands were not discovered, but they were stolen, they were colonized, they were taken by European nations and eventually by the U.S. government. And I think it's important to remember that all of these lands, all throughout Turtle Island, had host people, original nations who were living here, who were either ethnically cleansed or removed from these lands. And I want to honor especially the Piscataway people, who are the host people of the lands where I'm living on today.
Okay.
In regards to what you said about the nation being disenrolled in the state of Massachusetts, I saw the headline. I have not looked fully into what the background is behind that,
Okay.
but essentially to remove the tribal nations' status for their lands, and to try and disenroll them as a tribe recognized by the government. Again, this just goes back to the foundations of our country, which are rooted in the doctrine of discovery, which basically says that white people, Europeans, are the true title holders of these lands because they are human and the rest of us were mere savages. And so this, while I don't know the details of what happened in Massachusetts, it's not surprising. You know, the doctrine of discovery is still a part of the foundations of our country.
Yeah.
It's still used by the Supreme Court as recently as 2005 to recognize land titles. And so, yeah, I don't know the details of what happened in Massachusetts. I did see the headline, but it's just it's an indication of our nation and where we're still at, which is we still have this deeply embedded doctrine of discovery that is rooted in the lie of white supremacy and racism and sexism and everything else. And this is one of the things my campaign is trying to work to both deconstruct as well as to offer a new vision for, which is to build a nation where we the people truly means all the people.
Yeah, just for people who are not of Native American descent or someone watching this years from now or in another country, that would be the equivalent of, say, your mother being told that she's no longer Dutch, she's just another German.
Well, essentially, I mean, when you look at what the Doctrine of Discovery is, it's these series of papal bulls written in the 1400s. Says things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. So essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours to take. And so this is why European nations went into Africa, colonized the continent, because they didn't see and enslave the people, because they didn't see them as human. The same reason we refer to Columbus as this country refers to Columbus as the discoverer of America. You can't discover lands already inhabited. That's called stealing. The fact that we have statues, monuments, history books identifying Columbus as the discoverer of America reveals the implicit racial bias of our nation, which is that Native peoples, people of color, are not fully human. And so this is the challenge where the relationship between the federal government of the US and Native nations is at best parental and at worst outright dehumanizing. I often tell people that, yeah, we have a lot of discussion about tribal sovereignty in our country. But because of the doctrine of discovery, Native nations are sovereign over their lands, much like your teenage son or daughter is sovereign over their bedroom. You know, sure, they can put a sign on the door. Sure, they can try and lock the little flimsy lock that's on the handle. But ultimately, it's in their parents' house, and they're the ones who control what happens throughout the entire house, including their bedroom. And that's the same relationship that that the federal government has with all Native nations, with all Native tribes. It's at best very parental and at worst outright dehumanizing.
People can look on your website, markcharles2020.com or Wireless Hogan, and I'll link to all these websites below this interview. You several times go into your biography. If you could just, in a few minutes, just give a little précis of who you are, and you mentioned your mother's and father's ethnicities, but where you grew up, and how these things shaped you.
Yeah, so I grew up in a border town to the Navajo Nation, a small city, our small town known as Gallup, New Mexico. Actually, I was born on a mission compound just outside of Gallup. That was a mission started by the Christian Reformed Church of North America. It's called Rehoboth. It began back in the early 1900s, maybe 1902, 1903. Started out as a school, a church, and a small clinic, or eventually became a hospital. The school was a boarding school. It was one of these they're both government and religiously run boarding schools that were established to forcibly assimilate Native peoples to Western European culture and religion. So the children were taken out of their homes. They were put into these literally military-style boarding schools, punished for speaking their languages, punished for practicing their culture. The stories of abuse, neglect that happened both mentally, physically, emotionally, sexually in these schools is gut-wrenching. And the last of these schools didn't even end up closing until the 1970s and 80s. And the mission compound I was born at ran such a boarding school from the early 1900s, and it didn't cease being a boarding school until I think it was the early 1990s. I was there in the 1970s and 80s as it was transitioning from a boarding school to a day school. So I was attending the school as a day school student that had a vastly different experience than many of the Native students who were there attending it as boarding school students. My grandparents on my father's side were both boarding school survivors. And they both, through that experience, they were taught the lesson that their best way to have a peaceful and or somewhat successful life was to disregard the customs and ways of our native peoples, our Navajo people, and to walk into this Western world. And so they didn't teach my father the Navajo language. They didn't teach my father the customs of our nation. And so I grew up not speaking my language, not understanding my culture, and attending this school that was, half day school, half boarding school. But certainly, even as for day school students, didn't have a value for teaching the Navajo culture, or even for honoring the Navajo culture or language while I was attending there. And so I grew up in that environment. Graduated from that school in the late 80s, and then went on to college at the University of California in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And I graduated from there in 1995, I think is when I got my diploma, and had my bachelor's in history. Mm-hmm. Moved around for a little bit. I lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico for a few years. I lived in San Francisco for a few years. Moved back to Los Angeles for a few years, got married. My wife and I moved from Los Angeles back to Gallup, New Mexico, where I began, was with my family. My family lived there. My parents and my siblings lived there, and we moved back there for a number of years. And then I was, again, a part of this mission church at Rehoboth, and was called actually to pastor a church in Denver, Colorado, in the early 2000s. And I was the pastor of a church called the Christian Indian Center in Denver, Colorado for about 2 years. And it was while I was living there in Denver, and one of the things our church was really beginning to wrestle with was, what does it mean to be Native American and be Christian? Yeah. How does our culture, our language, our understanding of the sacred impact who we are and how we worship Jesus and practice the Christian faith? And it was during that time I got involved with a group called the World Christian Gathering on Indigenous Peoples. And I began meeting regularly with not just Native, but Indigenous Christian leaders from all over the world who were going through this sort of renaissance, if you will, of understanding how our culture, how our languages impacts the way that we practice our faith of Christianity and our following of Jesus. That was a very eye-opening experience for me. Yeah. And through that experience and through some other experiences, decided that if I really wanted to continue leading and being a part of this dialogue, I had to move back to our Navajo Nation. And so my family and I moved after 2 years from Denver, Colorado, back to the Navajo Nation. And for 3 years, we lived in a very remote section of our reservation. We were in a sheep camp 6 miles off the nearest paved road on a dirt road. We had no running water, no electricity. The family we lived with wove rugs and herded sheep for a living. And we were out there for 3 years. When we moved there, we were completely prepared to live off the grid. We were completely prepared to kind of haul our water and live by candlelight. And but the most surprising thing we experienced while living there was the incredible, both systemic and personal isolation that we experienced. One of the things we learned very quickly is that the only group of non-natives who ever go to Indian reservations are those who come to give you charity or those who come to take your picture. Almost nobody comes for the purpose of just getting to know you. And
your humanity comes second to your Native American identity to them. You're more like a trinket from a shelf rather than a person.
Well, not just to them, to the nation. Uh-huh. I mean, this is how the whole nation views Native peoples. Mm-hmm. And beginning to understand how deeply real the current marginalization of Native communities are in our world, and the way they're viewed by society, the way they're treated by the rest of the country. the way that we're just understood as people or even as savages. And so that was a very, very challenging time, because not only were we getting adjusted to living off the grid, but we were also experiencing this very intense marginalization. You know, it literally felt like we had dropped off the face of the earth. And again, the only people we were seeing who weren't native were those who were there to give us charity or there to take our picture. And those are the people who came. I could probably count on one hand the number of non-native peoples who came to visit us that first year and a half in the Hogan. You know, whether it was friends or family or just anyone else who was not native or from the reservation. And so it was extremely challenging. And at the same time, I'm witnessing the historical trauma of our people. I'm experiencing this intense marginalization. I'm seeing how we're being left out of national dialogues. And I'm becoming not only very aware of these things, but very angry about them. I'm also, you know, I was a history major in college, and I'm beginning to continue to study and learn more about history, living on the reservation. I'm unlearning and getting exposed to this doctrine of discovery, what it is, and becoming more aware of how it's impacting our nation. And during this time, I can feel like, as I'm trying to process through this whole new world I'm experiencing while we're living there, I'm still talking with some of my non-native friends as well as my native friends. Most of my non-native friends, I'm talking with them either over the phone or by email. Again, no one's coming to the reservation to see us. And every time these topics come up, I can feel my emotions kind of getting heightened. And soon I have to hang up the phone because I'm about ready to start yelling at my friends. And so I learned how to kind of disconnect emotionally from the situation that I'm living in and that I'm talking about. And I trained myself how to talk about it much like I would talk about something I read in the newspaper. And I found when I did that, I could stay engaged in the dialogue better. But then it wasn't long before my friends began to get offensive or get defensive or begin to respond negatively. And soon they would hang up the phone because they were so upset about the things we were talking about. And one day I was sitting down writing a letter. It's like for the 10th time, trying to get my friends to understand how it felt to be native and live on an Indian reservation, the Navajo Nation. And in this letter, I wrote and I said, being native and living on the reservation, it feels like our native communities are this old grandmother who has a very large and very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they locked us upstairs in the bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture, they're eating our food, they're having a party inside our house. Now, they've since come upstairs and they've unlocked the door to our bedroom, but it's much later, and we're tired, we're old, we're weak, we're sick, so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that hurts us the most and causes us the most pain is that virtually nobody from this party ever comes upstairs. Seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her on the bed, takes her hand, and simply says, thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house. I wrote that, and immediately I'm like, that's it. That's exactly how I'm feeling. I started sharing that with people around me, both native and non-native. People on the reservation would say to me, you know, I've lived here a long time, maybe some even all my life. I've always struggled to articulate how it feels, and you're hitting the nail on the head. I'd share this with my non-native friends. And instead of getting defensive, they would come back and say, well, what does it mean to say thank you? How does my family, how does my community, how does my town, how does my church, how does my nation express gratitude to the host people of these lands? Now we're having a very different dialogue. Now, instead of having a conversation about victim versus oppressor, now we're having a dialogue about what I think is the true challenge we're facing, which we have this reversal of roles, where we have a white majority that has this mythological history They're literally undocumented immigrants. They've never asked for, nor have they ever been given permission to be here. And they're living like they own the place. Meanwhile, we have 300 plus million of them. Meanwhile, we have 6 million native peoples, indigenous hosts of Turtle Island, who have been pushed aside to reservations and marginalized communities and are now being treated as unwanted guests in someone else's house. And we need to reverse those roles. I need white America to understand in some very real and practical ways they are guests in someone else's house. And I encourage our native peoples to understand in some very real and practical ways we are the host people of the land. And we need to step into our role as the host.
Well, that's a good metaphor, Mark. To just use that to get back to what I said about the Wampanoag tribe thing just recently, it's almost like someone's now coming in and saying, "Oh, we forgot to take Grandma's stool that she's sitting on, and so let's just take that." Mark, before I move on to actually overtly political topics, I did want to talk about, you'd mentioned being a pastor, and I'm wondering two things. Number one, on a personal level, did any of your native friends think that you were a sellout using the white man's religion, Christianity? And secondly, let's say in an alternate universe where a guy like you could actually win the presidency, have you ever thought about the mixture of state and religion? Let me ask the first part first, if you could.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the church, the Christian church, has been complicit in the oppression by Western governments going back almost 2,000 years. I published a book probably about last November. It came out. It's actually titled Unsettling Truth. It's the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery. My co-author was a good friend of mine who's a professor at North Park Theological Seminary. And in our book, not only do we go through what this doctrine of discovery is and how it's been embedded into the foundations of our nation, but we actually start with how did the Christian church, which was founded on the teachings of Jesus, who said things like love your neighbor and pray for those who persecuted you, who told his disciples when they joined him that they were going to be persecuted and rejected by society. How does a church go from that teaching to becoming an entity that literally kills people who doesn't look like, sound like, worship like, or behave like they do? And that's a very important piece of understanding of how this works, because I have to answer that for just myself as a Native man who follows the teachings of Jesus, but has serious problems with what I would call Western Christianity and Western church and religion. And in that book, one of the things that we uncovered, that I uncovered while I was studying through this, is a lot of people will blame Constantine, who is the first quote unquote Christian emperor of Rome in the 4th century. And his conversion at this place called Melvane Bridge, a battle at Melvane Bridge, where he claimed that he saw a vision of the cross and he was instructed by Jesus to conquer under the symbol of the sign of this cross. And for years, I've blamed the heresy of Christendom or Christian empire on Constantine. But in researching this through the doctrine of discovery and looking at the influences of Constantine, there actually was a bishop. He was the bishop of Caesarea. His name is Eusebius. And he wrote a book in the early 4th century titled Ecclesiastical History, which is the history of the church. It's a volume of 11 books. It begins with kind of the birth of Jesus, and it goes literally through the Great Persecution and Constantine in the 4th century. The beginning, the first few volumes of the book kind of lay the foundation of who Christ is and establishes that the church was called to be persecuted. And throughout the book, it highlights many of the martyrs throughout church history who were killed and persecuted by the Roman government and by the governments of the world for their faith. It honors them for their piety, for their faith of sharing in the suffering of Christ. Around book 8, it introduces a emperor named Constantinius, who it talks about was more mild and blessed than some of the other emperors. And then it introduces his son Constantine, who literally, it says, I'm paraphrasing now, was ordained by God to lead Rome for such a time as this. And Eusebius begins propping up Constantine, even before his conversion, as a God-ordained emperor of Rome. And Constantine bites. Now, Eusebius does this because between books 8 and 9, he inserts another book. It's titled The Book of the Martyrs, and he talks about the great persecution which happened in 303 AD, and is one of the bloodiest persecutions in the history of the church. And he lays out how not only did he see many of these martyrs die himself, but he knew many of them personally. So the persecution of the church touches Eusebius personally. And he appears to decide that he no longer thinks it's this great idea to be involved in a religion that's meant to be persecuted. And so he begins propping up an emperor of Rome as the God-ordained savior of the church, ruler of Rome, creating this heresy known as Christian empire. Because if you read the teachings of Jesus, he was absolutely opposed to Christian empire. He was adamant he did not come to establish a worldly empire. He came to plant a church, and the goal of the church was to offer itself as a sacrifice for the world. And so Eusebius props up Constantine as this Christian emperor, and Constantine bites. He becomes a Christian. I would argue makes up a story of a vision and converts not only himself, but his entire empire to Christianity. Now, because if you want to perpetuate a heresy of Christian empire, and Jesus is absolutely opposed to that notion, one of the things you have to do is you have to write Christ out of ecclesiastical history. So if you're writing a book called Ecclesiastical History, the book called The History of the Church, and the church, Jesus taught that the church wouldn't end until the bridegroom, Christ, returned again. So the fact that you're writing about the history of the church reveals it hasn't ended yet. So your book cannot have a conclusion, just by very nature of the fact that you're writing it. But if you read Eusebius's version of ecclesiastical history, and you read it to the last chapter of the last book, you will learn that he absolutely has a conclusion for his book. And his conclusion has nothing to do with Christ. His conclusion is about the salvation that comes to Rome, not through Christ, but through Constantine. So he literally writes Christ out of ecclesiastical history and inserts Constantine. This is how this heresy of Christendom, Christian empire, is birthed. And I would argue that much of the Western church and much of the church in America is not based on the teachings of Jesus. It's based on the heresy of a Christian empire. And the Christian empire doesn't know Christ at all, or only knows him individually. It doesn't know him corporately. And so the first 4 chapters of the book make a very strong argument that Western Christianity and American Christianity is not actually a religion about following the teachings of Christ. It's a religion based on this heresy began by Eusebius, exacerbated by Constantine, colluded with by Augustine and Aquinas and other theologians, and results in the writing of the doctrine of discovery and this narrative of a promised land, and that white Europeans are God's ordained people, and Turtle Island is their promised land. And if you read the books of Joshua and Deuteronomy, that gives them the right to commit genocide. And there you have a summary of American history.
Well, let me get to the second part that I asked you about. If you were to become president, like I said, it would take, a lot in this world. But if you were president, how would you deal with other religions? You'd be president of all the people: atheists, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, etc.
I am a candidate who is a Christian. I'm not a Christian candidate. One of the most destructive things that's happened, I would even argue, in the history of the world, was the notion that the role of government was to make people Christian. This has literally baptized incredible violence, dehumanizing, enslavement, and even genocide, not only here in the US, but around the world. And I have no interest in trying to legislate my faith. I have no desire to make the United States of America a Christian nation. In fact, I'm adamant the United States of America is not, never has been, nor will it ever be Christian. The goal of the church is not to legislate its theologies. The goal of the church is to be a servant, a humble servant to the rest of the world. Yes, it has a leader and a teacher that it follows, and that's Jesus. But the goal is not to make everybody follow him. And so this is where, and if you look at our book, this is where the church becomes this very destructive agent of the empire, because when it turns from a church into Christendom, and the role of the church is now to establish Christian empire, this is why the church becomes very oppressive and abusive towards anyone who is outside of the select group. And so, because I've studied this, because I've understood this, because my family and my people have been on the receiving end of the horrors of a Christian empire, I have absolutely no interest in replicating that or allowing that to continue.
Okay, let me move on then to some of your policies as stated on your website. I want to, we can talk about all of them, but the four that I want to talk about, the first one is the Second Amendment. You are against gun control, or you are for gun control rather, and you're not high on the Second Amendment. You state that it's sort of been misconstrued. Can you just talk on that for a moment?
Yeah, well, again, the challenge we face as a nation is most people do not understand our history. They don't understand how our laws were written and why they were written. So in 1763, King George draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and he says to the colonies who are here that they no longer have the discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset the colonies. They wanted access to those lands. So a few years later, they write a letter of protest. In their letter, they accuse the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. And they go on to say that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason our founding fathers used this inclusive term, all men, because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. So our Declaration of Independence, as written, is a blatant and systemic white supremacist document that assumes the dehumanization of Native peoples and people of color. The Constitution, which begins with the words, we the people, if you keep reading just a few lines later down to Article 1, Section 2, the section that determines who is and who is not a part of this union, who is and who is not covered by this Constitution, the first thing you will note is it never mentions women. This is important because if you read the entire Constitution from preamble to the 27th Amendment, you will find that there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns. 51 he, him, and his, who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by the Constitution. There's not a single female pronoun in the entire document. So Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women. It specifically excludes natives, and it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who's left? Well, in 1787, that literally leaves white men. And technically, it was only white landowning men who could vote. See, we don't acknowledge this. The reason we have a constitution, the purpose it was written was not to give people like me rights. That's not why we have a constitution. We have a constitution to protect the rights and the interests of white landowning men. I'm wearing my hair today tied, my CA is tied with red yarn. The reason I'm wearing it tied with red yarn is because there was a crisis in Indian country known as missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, where literally hundreds, thousands of Indigenous women and girls have been reported missing or they've been murdered. And not only has government agencies, police forces not closed the cases on these individuals, in many instances, they've never even opened them. Literally, oftentimes their families are left to go out and look for them and to figure out what happened because the government is taking no interest in trying to work with these problems. It's a crisis throughout Indian country known as missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And a few months ago, last August, I was at the Frank Lemire Native American Presidential Forum. I was there with Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Julian Castro, Marianne Williamson. There were about 10 of the Democratic candidates and myself were there. And they asked every candidate how they would address this crisis in Indian country. And almost every candidate, including Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, they said something to the effect that they would propose a new law or a new policy to protect this vulnerable demographic. When they asked me what I would do, I said, well, when you have a Declaration of Independence that refers to natives as savages, and you have a constitution that never mentions women, you shouldn't be surprised when your Indigenous women go missing and get murdered, and society and government doesn't give a crap. A new law isn't going to solve this problem. This is a problem with our foundations. This is a systemic problem. We have to address it there if we want to fix what we're seeing up here. So when we look then at things like the Second Amendment, which is a very simple amendment, it's a couple clauses. I forget the exact wording of it. Let me actually look it up right here real quick, just so I don't misquote it.
Okay.
But the Second Amendment, which states, a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So the Second Amendment establishes two things: a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, and then it states the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So let's deal with the militia first. So the militia is a civilian army, right? It's an army in waiting, not to go against the government, to be used by the government in cases of enforcement and expanding whatever the government's trying to do. That's what a militia is. It's a civilian army waiting and ready to serve the government. And it states that a well-regulated militia, being necessary for the security of a free state. Now, in 1790, which is when they wrote the 1790s, early 1790s, which is when they wrote the Second Amendment, the U.S., what were they concerned about? Well, the Declaration of Independence states very clearly they were most concerned about the merciless Indian savages who King George had brought upon the inhabitants of our frontiers. This is what the nation was afraid of. They wanted to expand further west, which meant going into Indian lands, and they were afraid of the violence they would face because of that. This was a young country, it didn't have a strong military, and so they wanted to create a militia to be ready for the government to utilize to help control, remove, and even commit genocide against Native peoples. And throughout the history of our country, that is how militias have been used. President Abraham Lincoln used militias to help ethnically cleanse the state of Minnesota after the hanging of Dakota 38. And he removed all the Native nations out of the state of Minnesota to make way for the Transcontinental Railway. It's one of the lines went from Duluth, Minnesota to Seattle, Washington. Militias were also used to capture and terrorize Black people, especially slaves or people trying to escape slavery. So these are why we have militias. Second, the second clause states the right of the people to keep and bear arms. So this was written in the 1790s, just a few years after the Constitution. Now, in the Constitution, who is defined as we the people? Who is people?
White-landed males.
It's white men. So this is the debate we have. We have a Second Amendment that was literally established to create militias, to terrorize Black people, and to ethnically cleanse Native peoples. And it's argued that the right of the people, white men, to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So in the early 1900s, there was an act of terrorism in Oklahoma known as the burning of Black Wall Street, where literally there was a section of a city in Oklahoma that had the highest per capita or the highest number of Black-owned businesses of any place in the nation.
That was in Tulsa, I believe, right?
Yes, it was in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And one day there was a young Black man who worked as a shoe shine outside of on the street, and there was a store, a building behind him, and he had permission from the owner to use the bathroom there. And he went into the store and was taking the elevator up to use the bathroom. And there was a young lady who was running the elevator. As they were going up, she screamed and jumped out of the elevator. And the young Black man was grabbed by people in the store. He was accused of sexually harassing her, even though she declined to press charges. I think that even she's accused of raping her. And then he was being taken down to the police station. So the Black men of the city went there to protect him. They were armed. That encounter turned violent. And the leadership of the city literally sectioned off this Black-owned business area of the city. And they deputized white people to go in to both arrest and kill the Black citizens of that city. They didn't let anyone in or out, including first responders such as fire departments and police officers. Private people flew their planes over that section of the city and dropped homemade bombs on the Black-owned businesses to burn them and the houses. This lasted for 48 hours. End of that time, there was a ton of dead Black people. Also, many of them were arrested and imprisoned. They finally let the fire department go in and they began to respond to some of the things. It was labeled an act of terrorism, and not a single insurance claim was paid out to any of the Black citizens of Tulsa. And this act did not result in gun control. Now, in the 1960s, I think it was, the Black Panthers read the Second Amendment and had the notion that this amendment might also apply to them and give them right to keep and bear arms. And so they armed themselves and began policing the police in Northern California, watching for harassment of Black people by the police and shouting their rights and standing there protecting them while they were being confronted by the police. In an act of protest, several of these Black Panthers went to the state capitol, fully armed, and began walking through it. They got about halfway before they were detained, but they couldn't be held because they weren't breaking a law. They were doing nothing illegal. They weren't shooting anybody. They had the right to have guns. They were merely in the state capitol, fully armed. They were arrested but not held. Within a few months, California had bipartisan gun control backed by the NRA. Why? Because the Second Amendment was established for two reasons: to create a militia, to terrorize Black people, and to ethnically cleanse Native peoples, as well as to arm white men. That's why we have a Second Amendment. And our history demonstrates that. And so today we have the right and the left screaming about it. We have the left saying we have a well-regulated militia and the government can say nothing about it. And we have the right saying that. We have the left saying that, well, you know, let me say it one more time. We have the right, which is saying we have
you need to have a well-regulated militia.
No, we have the right saying that the right of people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Yeah. And we have the left saying these are supposed to be regulated. But the argument is coming from white people on both sides. Meanwhile, when something happens to a person of color, the NRA doesn't stand up and say squat. Why? Because the Second Amendment does not give the right of people of color to keep and bear arms. That's not why we have a Second Amendment. This amendment is dripping in white supremacy and racism. And so I'm not saying we don't need gun control. I'm saying the Second Amendment is not a good tool. It's not even intended to solve the challenges we're facing today. Yeah. It's dripping in white supremacy and racism, and we have to get rid of it and get something in our foundations that actually applies to everybody.
Mark, I was born in 1965. I grew up in inner city New York, and when I was a boy, there was a thing known as boiled cocaine that was called pop, and it poor whites, working class whites, minorities, Hispanics, blacks, and even the few Native Americans that were in the city, a lot of them were into it. Then in 1983, when Ronald Reagan was president, this got a new sexy name called crack, and because white suburban kids were using it, it became an epidemic, even though it had been around for 10, 12, 15 years in poor urban areas. Reading your piece or reading the stuff you have about the opioid crisis on your website, it seems to me that that's a very similar way that the opioid crisis has played out. It didn't become a problem until young white kids, basically, or white people were into it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, if you look at the research and the data that's out there regarding especially death by opioid addiction or opioid overdose, and in the 80s and early 90s, the number of people of color dying from opioid overdose was higher than that of white people. In the late 90s, the number of white people dying from opioid addiction and overdose became equal with that of people of color. They were dying at the same rate. Very late 90s, early 2000s, the number of white people dying skyrocketed, astronomically higher, at a higher rate of death by opioid addiction and drug and overdose of white people than people of color. Now, if you look at the same policies of our nation, it was in the 80s and early 90s where Ronald Reagan declared a war on drugs, which very clearly was a war on race. And then Bill Clinton came up with the 3 strikes you're outlaw and learned out how to perfect this use of mass incarceration given by the white supremacist and genocidal President Abraham Lincoln to incarcerate people of color. And they perfected, both him and Ronald Reagan perfected that. And that was in place. And then in the late 90s, early 2000s, when the rate of white people dying became higher than people of color, this is when our policies began changing. So before we were criminalizing drug use and allowing people to die on the streets and to die in our prisons. When more white people began suffering from this challenge, this is when we've been coming out with new methods of treating people on the streets and treating this problem for what it is, which is it's a health crisis, not a criminal crisis. So what it took for our nation to begin to treat this crisis correctly was for more white people to die than people of color. And so this is the challenge, again, we face this as a nation, which is we have foundations that were written to protect white men. That's why we have these. And even the things we've done as a nation to try and fix those, like the 13th Amendment. This is the amendment that became the legacy of Abraham Lincoln, which many think it abolishes slavery, but if you actually read it, the 13th Amendment, what it says is that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party has been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. The 13th Amendment doesn't abolish slavery. It redefines it and codifies it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. If you go back and read the writings of Abraham Lincoln, he was a blatant white supremacist who stated repeatedly that he had no intention of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of allowing them to hold office, nor to intermarry. He stated frequently, that there was a physical difference between the white and black races, which he thought would forever forbid the two from living in terms of social and political equality. And as long as they must remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And he, as much as any other man, believed the superior position belonged to the white race. I'm quoting Abraham Lincoln from the Lincoln-Douglas debates there. Abraham Lincoln was a blatant white supremacist. There is a quote hanging at the Lincoln Memorial that says, "My primary object in this struggle is not to save or destroy slavery, it's to preserve the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it. And if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." There's a quote hanging at the Lincoln Memorial that literally states, according to Abraham Lincoln, black lives don't matter. Abraham Lincoln was a blatant white supremacist who didn't give a crap about black people. And in 1862, he signed the Pacific Railway Act, which provided the land and the resources to complete the Transcontinental Railway. Within 2.5 years of signing that bill, he had literally ethnically cleansed through the hanging of the Dakota 38 and the nullifying of all the treaties in Minnesota, through the massacre at Sand Creek in Colorado and the Long Walk in the territory of New Mexico. Abraham Lincoln has literally ethnically cleansed Minnesota, Colorado, Wyoming, and the territory of New Mexico to make way for the Transcontinental Railway, removing the native tribes from all of those lands, making him, by both percentage and numbers, one of the most genocidal presidents in the history of our nation. Abraham Lincoln did not believe we the people meant all the people. And so he had no interest in creating a society where blacks were equal to white people. And so in his amendment to abolish slavery, he didn't abolish it, he kept it legal in prison. The thread of mass incarceration for people of color was the brainchild of Abraham Lincoln, of what you do with your people of color if you want to remove them from the institution of chattel slavery, but you don't think they're equal. You don't think they should be free. You don't want them a part of your society. So you create an amendment that allows your white police forces, your white judges, your white jurors to put them in prison on a whim. And so this is what happened when drug addiction began to be a problem, and especially it began to manifest itself within our communities of color. Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton used the tools given to them by Abraham Lincoln and used that to criminalize drug use so they could incarcerate the people of color who were suffering from this health crisis. When more white people began dying from this than people of color, the nation had a change of heart. Again, not because it gives a crap about people of color, but because now white people are dying from it. And so now it treats it like the health crisis that it is. I'm glad we're treating it this way, but this merely exposes the white supremacy and racism that's embedded into the foundations of our country and expressed throughout our policies.
Mark, let me pick up on that and sort of move it to a broader stage here. There's a number of other campaign points you make about education and immigration, but I want to talk about reparations. But before I do that, I want to also move on to the idea of poverty in general, not just in the Native American sector of this country, but with this coronavirus, we're seeing the real classism in this society. I work in a grocery store. I don't make any money doing any of this stuff on YouTube, as most people don't. And there's what's known as food deserts in a lot of urban areas where poor people cannot get to the suburban supermarkets to get stuff. And these things in these little markets are much more expensive. I'm out in the sticks here. I live in Texas. If I go 50 or so miles out from the major urban areas, you'll find these little podunk towns that, again, have these small little markets. They don't have major supermarkets, and they're paying more for their goods and services there. And I'm sure it's the same out in reservation lands, too, that there probably are not a lot of Safeways or Albertsons or whatnot. Let me just ask you about that. When we talk about food deserts and also medical deserts, in that there's not a lot of medical facilities that are available to people way out where, like you were saying, you were living 5 miles off on a dirt road, or people in inner city who can only take a bus somewhere and the buses don't go near the hospitals.
Yeah. Yeah, so the Navajo Reservation is one of the biggest food deserts in our country. We have 26,000 square miles of reservation land. That's larger than, if we were a state, we'd be the 40th largest state. We have 180,000 people living on our reservation. We have, I think when I lived there, we had a total of maybe 12 to 14 grocery stores. Over the distance, again, if we were a state, we'd be the 40th largest state. 26,000 square miles, 180,000 people, and we had 12 to 14 grocery stores. There was the Navajo Nation passed literally the first in the nation, not just soda tax, but junk food tax. Literally taxing all junk food, because the majority of the food available within 10 to 20 miles of most reservation homes was these little convenience stores that sold cupcakes and popcorn and all this other crap.
Which leads to diabetes and other medical complications.
Diabetes on native land is an absolute epidemic. And so again, this is the challenge that we're facing as a country is there are people the nation was built for, and there are people the nation was built on. And so again, one of the primary planks of my platform is I am calling for a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation I would put on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that happen in South Africa and Rwanda and in Canada. I wouldn't call ours Truth and Conciliation, though, because conciliation implies there was a previous harmony, which isn't accurate in American history. If you read our foundations, written to benefit who? White landowning men. So that there's three groups of people that are systemically excluded from our foundations: people of color, women, and the poor. And so this is why we face these challenges we're facing today. Now, Bernie Sanders gets one aspect of that. He gets the class thing. He's been talking about economic inequality, the need for universal health care, all these other things, and he absolutely gets the class piece of it. He does not get race, and I'm not convinced he gets gender. He doesn't see how those things are just as involved and even often cases more systemically excluded than class is. At least you can possibly work your way out of class. You can't work your way out of gender, nor can you work your way out of race. And so this is the challenge that we're facing. And this is why so much of even the candidates who think they get it don't actually get it, because they don't understand the depth of what's actually embedded into our foundations. And it's race, gender, and class, all three of those.
Well, let me just ask then, because that's a natural segue into reparations. Obviously, there was the Japanese internment during World War II, and 40, 50 years later, that led to some small minor payments. The two big things, obviously, being Native Americans, their genocide and reservations, and then Black Americans, the Middle Passage, and slavery, and then Jim Crow, and still to this day. But are there also reparations for, say, more specifically, for example, the U.S. government has a history of doing unauthorized medical testing on people who were not that smart, for example, or said that, had a certain intelligence level, and they were given certain drugs, people who were in insane asylums and whatnot. When we talk about reparations, are we talking about reparations for all of these groups or just some?
Well, right now the dialogue going on in the Democratic Party is reparations for the descendants of former slaves. Uh-huh. And I think that's a very important conversation to have. I would agree reparations need to be paid. The challenge I have with the conversation that is taking place in the Democratic Party is, again, as I said earlier, we've never abolished slavery as a nation. Slavery is still 100% legal in prison. And today it's been noted that there are more Black men under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system than we had enslaved in 1850. We have the highest rate of incarceration of any country in the world. 1 out of every 5 prisoners in the world is based in the U.S. And we incarcerate people of color at 3 to 5 times the rate that we incarcerate white people. And so the challenge I have with the discussion about reparations going on in the Democratic Party is that if you are part of a class action lawsuit, and a major corporation or a group of corporations are being sued or brought to court because of some deep systemic thing that they did to a vast amount of people, and the class action lawsuits initiated, and most of the times those don't go to court, they get settled out of court. And if there's a settlement and you're covered by this class action lawsuit and you are scheduled to get a piece of that settlement, I can almost promise you that you will not see that settlement until you sign a piece of paper that says this issue is now laid to rest. Yeah. And you will not sue that entity again over this issue. If we allow white America, if we allow our country to pay the fine for slavery before we actually abolish it, I promise you it will never get abolished. And so while I think reparations needs to be discussed, simultaneously, if not even a precursor to that discussion, we have to decide, are we actually going to abolish slavery or not? That's the question I'm pressing in my campaign. I want to be the candidate, and this is embarrassing to say nationally, who actually abolishes slavery. It's kind of sad we have to say that in 2020, that you have to run on a platform that you want to abolish slavery, but we've never abolished it in our country. Mm-hmm. It's still 100% legal in prison.
Mark,
and we need to change that.
Mark, let me just ask you, since Michael Bloomberg had his sort of vanity run for president, the term non-disclosure agreement came up. It seems to me that a lot of what you were saying about reparations sort of amounts to sort of like a cultural non-disclosure agreement. Oh, we'll pay this, but then let's not talk about it anymore.
Absolutely. This is the challenge. I love what happened with the Lakota people. I should say that. I love the response of the Lakota people based on the injustice that happened to them. Their sacred mountain was stolen, not Rushmore.
Yeah.
And this nation carved the faces of their president, including one of their most genocidal presidents towards Native peoples, Abraham Lincoln, onto this mountain, completely desecrating it to the Lakota people. Later, they had some second thoughts, our country did, and decided, well, maybe we shouldn't have done that. And they offered to pay the Lakota people for Mount Rushmore. And the Lakota people said, it's not for sale. You can't pay us for it. I love that response. That the Lakota people are not allowing this country to merely pay a fine to cover its injustice, to fix a problem that, or to get away with a problem that hasn't even been fixed yet. Mm. This is what one of the challenges I have about reparations. And again, I think it's an important issue and they need to be paid. But the challenge is reparations reduces the oppression of African people down to merely labor. And so the way you get a value for reparations is you calculate the number of people enslaved, the duration of their enslavement, and you multiply it by some hourly rate.
And Mark,
come up with some number.
Mark, this is I think the problem with capitalism, the old saying that a capitalist knows the price of everything but the value of nothing.
Yeah, this is the problem. And so what it does is it reduces their oppression down to simply labor, and it doesn't even begin to address the dehumanizing oppression that happened so that they could extract that labor.
Yeah.
And this is so there are so many lessons. Like I said before, the United States of America is a nation that has never asked for, nor have they ever been given permission to be here. And they live here like someone might live in a hotel room. They have no idea why that mountain sits over there, no idea why that river flows over there. They have this economic lens on everything. As Native peoples, our creation stories take place here. They tell us why that mountain sits over there, why that river flows over there, and these stories exhort us, even demand that we live here sustainably.
Yeah.
One of the things it means for Native peoples to be the host people of this land is to teach our colonizers how to live here correctly. I talk about the United States, and I say that the United States of America is a nation that desperately needs to be adopted. It needs to be taken under someone else's wing and parented and instructed how to live here in a healthy way. I loved what happened at Standing Rock a few years ago. Hundreds of tribes, tens of thousands of Native peoples coming together in a unified voice, saying to our colonizers, you can't drink oil. And water is life. Trying to teach them something that is not a part of their cultural worldview. There are some things you cannot put a value on. You cannot pay us for the mountain that you stole. You can't drink oil. trying to get this nation to understand that when you only have an economic capitalistic viewpoint on the world around you, it absolutely will lead to your own demise.
Well, we are seeing this with Corona, aren't we? I mean, if we look at all the viruses and diseases of the last 20, 30 years, they're almost always from things where ecologies have been degraded. We're cutting down in the Congo, in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Amazon, in China. And people are coming into contact with creatures and environments they were never exposed to before. And this is how we get the spread of things like Ebola and coronavirus. And then we see the economics of that, and that certain people are not worth enough. Let's get the economy roaring, but let's not talk about the people who die, and they're going to be mostly poor people in this country and elsewhere.
Let's talk about coronavirus for a moment here.
Yeah.
In the last 2 weeks, we have seen unprecedented change in our nation. It started about maybe 10 days ago, when literally for the first time, President Trump admitted we have a problem. It took him 3 months to admit we actually have a problem on our hands. And thankfully, almost overnight, nearly everything began changing in our country. Now, this, of course, was prefaced by one of the few things that white landowning men pay attention to, which is Wall Street. And it was prefaced by the Dow and the value of Wall Street. I don't want to use the word crashing, but coming to an absolute screeching halt. And now we just signed yesterday into law a $2.2 trillion economic stimulus plan to prop up this economy. And the majority of the stimulus goes to prop up corporations, not individuals. And the goal is to get the economy back up and running again. Well, let's think about this. So 3 weeks ago, right? Our economy was in the longest bull market it's ever had, 11 years of consistent growth. Historically low unemployment numbers. It was literally 3 weeks ago, President Trump was bragging that the United States had the most prosperous economy in the history of the world. Okay? If there was ever a point in our nation's history, in the history of capitalism, where our economy should have been able to withstand something like the coronavirus, it would have been last week. And we couldn't last 5 days. And we have now signed a $2.2 trillion stimulus package that we don't have the money for. This is merely just going on the credit card.
Yeah.
And what it's proven, again, executives and white lending men are losing some of their investment value. But who's really hurting? What has been exposed is that I think the number was 80% of our nation is literally living paycheck to paycheck. So while we had this astronomically high stock market and we had this incredibly low unemployment, what we had was the bulk of every American was not able to hand, I think the number was a mere $600 hit to their monthly income.
Yeah.
This economy, even 3 weeks ago, even 3 months ago, absolutely was not working. And now we just added another $2.2 trillion to prop up a broken economy. And no one should be surprised that the bulk of that investment went to prop up corporations and not to the individual people who are literally hurt by this crisis. One of the things that I've been saying for the past week on my campaign, I'm doing live streams every day on my campaign YouTube channel at Mark Charles 2020. One of the things I've been saying is that I have very little control of how our nation responds in the next 10 months to this crisis. I have very little control of what policies get passed about social distancing, about how soon our country and our economy reopens, about how we get ventilators to hospitals, or how we compensate teachers and people who have lost their jobs. I have very little control over that. And it's easy and tempting to armchair quarterback every decision that's being made. But while that may get you more likes or more follows on social media, it's not going to help solve people's problems. So one of the things I'm focusing on right now is, given the responses we're making and the trajectory we're on, where do I think we're going to be in 10 months when I very possibly, or when we will inaugurate a new president, and that person will have the ability to begin making the changes and adjustments we need. So where will we be in 10 months? Right now, there's this, I don't even know what to call it, this dream that President Trump thinks we can have the nation open again for business by Easter.
Yeah.
I got a letter from my kids, an email from my kids' school that said they're canceling school through April 24. There's this notion that many people have that somehow within the next 2 to 3 months, our nation is going to be back up and running for business again. Even conferences I'm supposed to speak at are getting not canceled, but postponed until later summer or early fall. There's this notion that if we can just make it through this next 6 to 8 weeks, things are going to be okay, and we can go about our business as normal again. There's a lot of emphasis, and it needs to be out there, that we have to flatten the curve and get over this hump.
Yeah.
Those are the two things everyone's focused on. Well, what's flattening the curve? What's the hump we're getting over? Well, it's this meteoric rise in people getting sick with this virus. How are we preventing that, or trying to prevent it? We don't have a cure. We don't have a vaccine. We don't even have treatment. All we have is social distancing. That's how we're flattening the curve. That's how we're getting over the hump. So if we get over the hump, if we flatten the curve and get on the other side of this, what got us there? Social distancing.
Yeah.
How far off is a vaccine? At the earliest, 12 to 18 months.
And even some of the treatments that are coming from Cuba or China, we don't want to touch or acknowledge because they're not us.
Well, but even that, how else do you get? There's also talk about, well, maybe we can have what they call this Teflon effect, which is enough people get sick that hopefully you have enough people have an immunity to it,
yeah, that
it won't have a major, like you can go back to more business as normal. Well, this virus has like a 1.2% rate of death. To get to a place where we have a Teflon effect, enough people have been infected with this virus and have recovered, I think you need to get to like 40 to 50% of your population infected. That's 150 million people. 1.2 of that is about 1.5 to 2 million people will die if we get to that point. That's a horrible way to get to getting back to normal.
And that's capitalistic statistical analysis for you.
I am preparing my children and my family and my supporters on my campaign that there is a very strong likelihood that we will need some measure of disruptive social distancing for the next 12 to 18 months. Would it be nice if I'm wrong? Absolutely, it'd be nice. But we need to begin preparing for that. Right now, nobody's talking about it. Educators are talking about we'll be back to school in the fall. Professional sports teams are saying we'll start the baseball season a few months late or a few weeks late. I don't know how we can think we're going to be cramming hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of people into stadiums, hundreds of people into cramped airplanes, children back into schools before we have a vaccine.
Yeah.
I don't want to be doomsday, but I'm trying to prepare people to say, I think we have to recognize that our lives and our economy and our society, not just in the US, but globally, is going to be disrupted. And this is not merely going to be a short pause in how we do things.
Yeah.
And we need to begin to prepare for that. And so I'm looking literally this election coming up in November. We will be electing a president who will be charged with rebuilding our economy, rebuilding our healthcare system, rebuilding our school systems, and helping us figure not only how do we navigate in the world for the next year, but how do we navigate in this reality that something like this is very easy to happen again.
Yeah. And Mark, do they even live in reality, Trump or Biden?
Well, and so this is what I'm saying is, who do you want to rebuild this? A white landowning male from the 1%? And if you look at President Trump, his vision for the nation is to make America great again. And the way he wants to do that is to erase the memory and the legacy of President Obama. Vice President Biden is running, and his primary goal is to erase the memory and the legacy of President Trump and bring us back to where we were 4 or 5 years ago, when again, the economy still was not working for everybody. We still didn't have health care for everybody. We still weren't fixing anything. So both of these men are running on the legacy of nostalgia. They want to bring us
false
back
nostalgia too.
What I'm saying is, this crisis has not changed my vision whatsoever. My vision from the start of my campaign a year ago, 10 months ago in May, when I announced my running, my vision was to build a nation where for the very first time, we the people meant all the people. Now, what I thought that meant was that we would have to deconstruct these systems that are already oppressing so many of our people. Well, what's literally happening in front of our eyes is these systems are falling apart on their own. So now I don't necessarily need to deconstruct them. I merely need to help people understand this is one of the reasons these systems failed. And as we rebuild them, we need to do it differently. We need to not build them on this doctrine of discovery, this white supremacy, racism, and sexism, this mythology of American exceptionalism. And we need to build them with an understanding that we the people means all the people. And so, you know, for a long time, Elizabeth Warren would say, I have a plan for that. Well, while I would never have hoped or wished that something like what's happened in the past 3 months would have ever happened to our world, but because it's happened, and because our systems are literally falling down in front of our eyes, my message to the American people is, I have a plan for that. We already knew these things needed to be rebuilt. We already knew they were not sturdy. We already knew they were not going to get us through a crisis. And now that they're falling apart, and now that we have to rebuild them anyway, let's rebuild them in a way that actually comes from an understanding where we the people truly means all the people.
Well, let me ask you, Mark, because I think this is an important point to bring up, is when we use that inclusive, we already knew. I really don't think that a lot of people know. I think one of the major problems is we have this zombie electorate. Give the poor and working people, give them their cable TV, give them their little cell phones, give them their social media, and they don't question things. It's a very uh, a sophisticated way to just gull people and brainwash them. People who we could use the term oppressed, a lot of them don't even recognize they're oppressed.
When I say we understood, yes, most of America lives in this mythology. Many people from the Native community, many people from the African American community, many women, many people from LGBTQ communities. As I've traveled around the country campaigning for the last 9 months, and even before that, lecturing on the doctrine of discovery for years ahead of that, there are a large number of people who know in some very real ways that we the people doesn't include them. They're very aware of that. They're very aware. People of color are very aware we the people doesn't include them. Women are very aware we the people doesn't include them. Native peoples are very aware that we the people doesn't include us. Members of the LGBTQ community can be very aware that we the people doesn't include them. Many of the people who are living on the margins are very aware this thing doesn't work. Now, there might be some hesitancy to deconstruct it because the evil you know is sometimes easier to accept than the evil you don't know. And so deconstructing these systems that even though they oppress us, we've gotten used to, can seem daunting. But what I'm saying now is we don't even need to deconstruct them. They are literally crumbling in front of our eyes. All we need to do is take a lesson from why they crumbled and then begin to construct them on a more solid foundation.
Mark, I want to pick up on some of the things mentioned in the last 20 minutes or so that, and it has to do with, I would say, the whole culture of lie and deceit. You'd mentioned about the longest bull market, yet back when George W. Bush was president, they started counting unemployment in a different way, where certain people, after a certain amount of time, they're not considered unemployed. So when you talk about 3.5% unemployment, you're really talking about unemployment 3 or 4 times as high. When we're talking about, you were talking about, for example, the Democrats and their internal conversations about this or that. Isn't that just really the patina to say, oh, we Democrats care more than the Republicans? Because I can tell you, I don't think they do. I don't think the Democratic National Committee gives a rat's ass about poor people, Native Americans, black people, or any other religious or ethnic or sexual minorities. They just want to throw out the bone to keep you, to get that little vote. And if they don't get your vote, they're going to play with voting machines. They're going to close down polling stations in areas where they're not going to get their way. I don't think there's really much of a difference between the Republicans and Democrats, which is why, with the exception of twice for Obama, and I'll get to him in a moment, I voted for him. I voted in the last 7 elections for third party or independent candidates. Do you really believe that Democrats care and about the bull market lie? You know.
No, I'm not running as a Democrat.
Yeah, I know.
I'm running as an independent.
Yeah.
Because as I've researched our history, as I've looked at both parties, I've come to the conclusion that both parties actually share a lot of the same systemic values.
Corporations.
There is a YouTube, a TEDx talk I gave about a year and a half ago. It's out on YouTube. It's titled "We the People: The 3 Most Misunderstood Words in U.S. History."
Yeah, I saw that.
In this YouTube video, I go through the 4 cases. Well, I go through one of the cases. I'll go through 2 of the cases, but there's 4 cases, Supreme Court cases, that mention the doctrine of discovery by name. The first one was in 1823. It's Johnson versus McIntosh. 2 men of European descent litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got it from a native tribe. The other one got the same land from the government. They want to know who owned it. Case goes to the Supreme Court. The court has to decide the principle that land titles are based on. And this is the John Marshall Court. And they rule that the land titles are based on the principle of discovery, they said, is what gives title to the land. And then they referenced the doctrine of discovery, stating that even though natives were here first, but because we're savages, we only have the right of occupancy to the land, while Europeans have the right of discovery to the land, and therefore they're the true title holders. Creates the legal precedent for land titles. That case and the doctrine of discovery get referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. My TEDx talk is primarily about the 2005 case. I go through it, I won't go through it all here, but I go through it step by step, outlining how it is one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime, based on the same dehumanizing arguments given in 1823. And it references the doctrine of discovery by name. That argument, that opinion was written and delivered by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Why? Because when your land titles are based on a dehumanizing doctrine of discovery, white supremacy becomes a bipartisan value. In 2016, President Trump ran Donald Trump ran for the U.S. presidency with a slogan of "Making America Great Again." Hillary Clinton, not to be outdone, responded by telling her supporters America's great already. In one of the general election debates, she expanded further and said, "America is great because America is good." Donald Trump turned, paused, looked at her, and said, "I agree with her. I agree with everything she just said." At the Democratic National Convention, President Obama jumps into the fray and says, "America is great already." Cory Booker, African-American senator from New Jersey, he's on the main stage. He's endorsing Hillary Clinton. In his speech, he acknowledges the Declaration calls natives savages. He acknowledges the Constitution excludes women and has a 3/5 compromise. Now, this is courageous because most politicians at that level don't acknowledge any of those flaws. But he ends that section of his speech by telling the Democratic National Convention that these things do not detract from our nation's greatness. See, we were duped. We thought the 2016 election was a decision between racism versus anti-racism, equality versus inequality. If Donald Trump says "Make America Great Again" and Hillary Clinton says "America's great already," they both agree our past, our history, our foundations are great. They disagreed if we were great in 2016. Donald said no and Hillary said yes. See, it wasn't about racism versus anti-racism, equality versus inequality. The decision we were making in 2016 was, did we want Donald Trump and the Republican Party to make us explicitly white supremacist, racist, and sexist again? Or did we want Hillary Clinton and the Democrats to work to keep our white supremacy and racism implicit? That's the difference between the two parties. They both have a shared value for white supremacy. They disagree on the explicit versus implicit expressions of those values.
And they also are beholden to corporations. And I want to get to that in a moment.
I just did a live stream on my campaign YouTube channel last week titled "Joe Biden, President Obama, and the Democratic Party." And I went through step by step. See, I don't think Joe Biden understands that the reason President Obama asked him to be his vice presidential candidate is not because Joe Biden has this great history and legacy with Black people. It's because Joe Biden made President Obama a Black man safe to white people. That's why he was selected as his VP candidate. I don't think Joe Biden understands that. And if you look at President Obama's 8 years in office, Joe Biden did absolutely that. President Obama started out, he ran on a vision of hope and change. When he got into office, he was accused of going on an apology tour. as he was more willing than other presidents on the international stage to take responsibility for some of America's flaws in foreign policy around the country historically. He was accused by white men of going on an apology tour. Over his 8 years in office, he slowly gave up that narrative and began to parrot the narrative of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is the coping mechanism for a nation that's in deep denial of its genocidal past, as well as its current racist reality. If you want to get white landowning men to vote for you, and presidential elections absolutely run through the heart of white landowning men, Iowa and New Hampshire are the gatekeepers. Iowa is the 6th whitest state in the country, and New Hampshire is the 4th. Iowa has the highest rate of land ownership of private lands of any state in the union. New Hampshire has the highest rate of home ownership. Iowa has a state law stating that they have to be the first caucus state. New Hampshire has a state law saying that they have to be the first primary state. If you want to be president in our nation's two-party system, you have to campaign for a year to year and a half to white landowning men in Iowa and New Hampshire, and they are literally the gatekeepers for the presidential process. Mm-hmm. So the way you get them to support you and vote for you is you have to tell them how exceptional they are. And if you look at the rhetoric of President Obama throughout his 8 years in office, if the first year he was accused of going on an apology tour, by his final year, he had learned absolutely to sing the sweet melody of American exceptionalism.
Yeah.
And actually sang it better than most white presidents. Why? Because he knew that was his way to stay in power. He raised $1 billion in his second presidential campaign. You do not raise $1 billion without making yourself incredibly safe to some very, very, very rich white people.
And I've read that Obama's now worth about $150 million since being president.
And so again, this is the challenge. This is what Joe Biden did, is he made President Obama safe to white people. Joe Biden and the Democratic Party will put us on a 100-year trajectory towards equality with an ever-moving target of actually getting there.
Yeah.
This is the decisions we're making. The decisions we're making between Republican versus Democrat. They agree on white supremacy. They agree on racism. They agree on sexism. They disagree on an explicit versus an implicit manifestation of those worldviews.
Yeah. Mark, let me just talk on Obama for a second here. And I was born when LBJ was president in 1965. And I could make a damn good argument that President Obama was easily the best president of my lifetime. Yet, I regret my 2 votes for him because he stabbed working class people in the back by not supporting a card check. He didn't close Gitmo. He could have taken a pen and written a presidential order. Didn't do that. He embraced drone strikes. Yeah, he killed Osama bin Laden. He stopped the Somali pirates. But he and Biden were also they actually before Trump were putting his Mexican kids into cages and so on and so forth. And you talk about him parroting, he didn't just parrot the rhetoric, he parroted the actions. And even if you look at, like, I read an article saying how Jimmy Carter was and Noam Chomsky said Jimmy Carter was the least violent of the American presidents, yet he did nothing but support people like in the massacre in East Timor back in the 70s. He supported all these tyrants. It's like, what the fuck? They don't learn. And I can say fuck because this is the internet. These people do not learn that you cannot support, quote unquote, the less of 2 evils because you are supporting an evil. What is your take on them?
This is why I'm running as an independent.
Yeah.
And this is why the challenge is that our nation has never wrestled with and dealt with our history. We still celebrate as a nation a Declaration of Independence that refers to natives as savages. we hold up as one of our greatest presidents nationally, bipartisan belief. Abraham Lincoln is our greatest president, and he was as genocidal, even more genocidal statistically, than Adolf Hitler was. And we hold him up as our greatest president. Why? Because who writes the histories? The winners. We've written our own history for 250 years. Had Nazi Germany won World War II, how would their history books have recorded Adolf Hitler as the greatest leader ever? How would their history books have recorded the Holocaust? We have Holocaust deniers now. Imagine if they won. What Holocaust? There was no Holocaust. This is exactly how we treat Abraham Lincoln and the genocide of Native peoples. That never happened. There's no genocide there.
We're not any different than Erdogan and the Turks.
We have this complete denial of our history. There's a native leader, Aboriginal leader. His name is George Erasmus. He's from the Dene people up in Canada. And he says that where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build a community, he said, you have to start by creating common memory. I love that quote. I think it gets to the heart of our nation's challenge with race, which is we do not have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers a mythological history of discovery and expansion, opportunity and exceptionalism. We have communities of color, women, other marginalized communities that have the lived history of stolen lands and broken treaties, of slavery and Jim Crow laws, of Indian massacres and boarding schools, of internment camps,
Lynching.
of segregation, mass incarceration, families being ripped apart at our borders, children being put in cages. We have no common memory, and there was no point in U.S. history where there was healthy community between the races. One of the things I'm running on, why I'm calling for a national dialogue on race, gender, and class, is so that we can create this common memory. Yeah. So we can actually begin to acknowledge who we are and where we came from. And until we can acknowledge who we are and where we came from, we have to continue to perpetuate the myth, both in our narratives and in our actions. Yeah. And if you want to be the nominee of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, you have to learn to parrot the mythology of American exceptionalism, which is rooted in the lie of white supremacy.
Well, Mark, let me just ask you this here. You talk about the cultural memory, but when people see things even up front, they don't acknowledge it. Give you an example. We've had now 5, 6, 7, 8 years of videos of black men being beaten or killed on camera, and it's all over YouTube. It's all over the Facebook. Just recently, there was a kid who was held against the wall just in the last 10 days, and he's saying, "What did I do? What did I do?" A cop is holding him, and then 5 or 6 other big burly white guys come in, and they beat the living crap out of him. And you know, people, it doesn't affect them. So how can you even really, talk about memory when it happens in front of their eyes? They're not even acknowledging at that moment, much less in their memory.
This is where I talk about, this is a symptom of trauma. So most people are aware of what's called PTSD, post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder. It's an individual diagnosis for someone who's experienced a horrifying event. It affects you physically, mentally, emotionally, relationally. It's kind of this all-encompassing condition. But it comes for a single person from a single event. So if you get assaulted, or if you're in a battle or a car accident, you can have post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, there's another trauma called complex PTSD. Complex PTSD doesn't come from a single event. It comes from a series of events. So if you can get PTSD from being in a battle, you can get complex PTSD from living in a war zone. If you can get PTSD from being assaulted, you can get complex PTSD from living in an abusive relationship. Psychologists have observed that complex PTSD can be passed down from one generation to the next. There's nothing conclusive of how this happens, but they observed symptoms of a complex PTSD in the children and grandchildren of people who experienced the traumas. Now, there's another trauma called historical trauma, which is not an individual diagnosis. It's how psychologists understand the dissatisfaction in a broad community. You can see it was originally identified and observed in Native communities after our history of residential schools and boarding schools, including our removal. You can also see symptoms of historical trauma in African communities, African American communities after segregation, Jim Crow laws, mass incarceration, and even slavery. You can see it in Japanese American communities after history of internment camps. You can see it in Jewish communities after the Holocaust. I refer to historical trauma as a multi-generational and communal manifestation of a complex PTSD. And by understanding this, it helps me and helps anyone who's aware of these things to engage communities of color in a more healthy way. Now, the first symptom of trauma is shock and denial, okay? Now, there's another trauma out there. Rachel McNair wrote a book on this called PITS, Perpetration-Induced Traumatic Stress. She identifies PITS as being like PTSD in almost every way, except if PTSD afflicts the victim of a horrifying event, PITS afflicts the perpetrator, the person who caused it. She looked at a very comprehensive study on Vietnam veterans, as well as this quote by Socrates, who said, "The doer of injustice is more miserable than the sufferer." She refers to it as the psychology of killing. If your state, your government gives you the right to kill people, what does that do to you psychologically? Yeah. Drone pilots, soldiers, what does it do to you? And she came up with this understanding of a perpetration-induced traumatic stress. So I hypothesize that if PTSD as a multi-generational communal manifestation of a complex nature that we identify as historical trauma that afflicts communities of color, that PITS must also have a multi-generational communal manifestation of a complex nature, which I observe is the trauma that's afflicting white Americans.
But
so I understand
you're
white
saying...
people as another group of traumatized people. And the first symptom of trauma is shock and denial. You can show a trauma patient, a traumatized person, clear evidence of whatever it is they're in denial of, and they will not see it because it is part of their defense mechanism. They shut those things down. And so one of the most effective tools I've developed in dealing with white America and helping white America to understand what its history is by treating white Americans not first and foremost as racist or even as fragile, but as traumatized.
That's an interesting. I never heard of the PITS before. I'll have to look it up after the interview, because my dad was he died in 1983 from cancer, several cancers, and I remember him taking us and my family away from parties where he got into arguments with relatives because they were calling Dr. Martin Luther King Dr. Martin Luther Coon and things like that, and he could never understand that. It's interesting. I'll have to look that up. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I'm very clear. White people are not victims of trauma. This doesn't excuse their behavior, nor does it justify it. It merely helps us understand their response to it, which is one of shock and denial. Yeah. This is a perpetration-induced traumatic stress at a multi-generational, communal, and complex level.
Well, Mark, in this final segment, before I give you a couple of minutes just to give any final statement, I do want to talk and if we can go just quickly through some of these things that are solutions. I wanted to talk about, number one, and these can just be quick answers since we're limited on time. Medicare for all, I would assume you are for that, for every medical care is a human right.
I actually addressed this. I did a live stream on my YouTube channel last week where I talked about Bernie Sanders and progressive Democrats. While I absolutely believe that healthcare is a right, not a privilege, if we try to enact Medicare for all before we deal with the white supremacy, racism, and sexism and classism embedded in our foundations, it will never be distributed equally. Again, this is the challenge. Bernie Sanders understands class. He does not get race, and I don't think he gets gender. And so there is almost no governmental program out there that is meant for everybody that gets distributed equally.
Let me just.
Could you imagine if we provided health care, right?
Yeah.
What would happen to women's reproductive rights if health care was now entirely in the hands of only the federal government? At the moment, without having a national consensus on the humanity of women and their agency over their own bodies, their health care would fluctuate depending on who was in office. If we don't deal with the racism, the sexism, and the white supremacy embedded in our foundations before we try to enact something like that, I promise you it will never be available equally.
Mark, let me pick up then. Andrew Yang, who had run on the Democratic side, had proposed a universal basic income. There's a fellow named Matt Brunig, however, who has a thing called the Social Welfare Fund for America, which is basically that instead of having taxes fund a universal basic income, that every citizen of the United States would be issued basically a share in this common fund where stocks and bonds for roads and utilities and basically like a giant municipal fund. What is your take on universal basic income or something like that where everyone is a part? Would that be kiboshed by the fact that, like you said, we haven't dealt with the race issue?
Again, yes, we have to deal with the race and the class issue and the sexism and all these other things. I was very intrigued by Andrew Yang and his campaign. I think he kind of suffered from one of the things Bernie Sanders suffered from in 2016, which he had a single issue and didn't know how to go much beyond that. I really like the way he's thinking outside the box as far as how do we deal with the fact that we have things being automated and being computerized, and it's radically changing not only the way we work, but in many instances the need to work. And I thought he had I liked his outside the box thinking on that. And he's definitely someone I would love, if we win and if we get our campaign where it's nationally recognized, he is definitely a voice I want in my ear. Because I like the way he thinks outside the box, and I love the way that he got as far as he did, really trying to get our nation to think about an issue from a new perspective.
Mark, let me talk to you about, you mentioned reservations. I've often thought that one of the ways to sort of rectify some of the inequality in Native Americans and also in territories is Puerto Rico, for example, should have 2 senators. Guam, Samoa should have 2 senators. And I would say that people in the reservation system, maybe you could divide up into 4 geographical areas and give 2 senators for each of those areas. Like say the Aleutians and Northwestern Indians, the rest of the Indians west of the Mississippi, and the north and south of the Mason-Dixon line, so that you could have at least 8 people as voices in the Senate. Is that something that you've ever thought of or have ever heard of?
So I wrote a series of articles, a couple of blog posts, maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, where I advocated for the creation of what I call the virtual Native American states. Living on the Navajo Nation, I was appalled to observe that you could become president of our country and not campaign to a single Native person. or not go to any reservations. And I proposed that a virtual Native American state where I said, what if for every, so like take for example the Navajo Nation, which again is 180,000 people on the reservation, 300,000 enrolled members, and 26,000 square miles. Again, we're bigger than 10 other states. And yet we don't have any impact on the Electoral College because we're in the Four Corners area. And so we're in,
You're split up.
northeast Arizona, northwest New Mexico, and southeast Utah. And we don't have a single congressional district in any state. So we have no impact on the Electoral College. So I said, what if instead what we did is we gave any Native person of a state or federal recognized tribe the option, instead of registering to vote in the city and county where they live, they could register to vote in a virtual Native American state. Those registrations would then be pooled, and they would be allocated the appropriate number of votes in the Electoral College. So there's 6 million natives, maybe 400,000 or 4 million, 3 million register in this virtual state. So we're allocated somewhere between 4 and 6 votes in the Electoral College. That would then force candidates to have to campaign to us. This was an idea I proposed probably 8 or 10 years ago. I still think it's a good idea. I haven't had a lot of discussion on it lately, but we need to find a way, because the Electoral College was developed. The reason we have an Electoral College is essentially to gerrymander and to maximize the influence of the white landowning male. The Electoral College assumes the woman and the person of color will not be able to vote, but it tries to count them in different measures based on how they saw their humanity, so that the white landowning male who could vote and who could serve in office would be able to have the most amount of influence over whatever number of other subhumans were kind of categorized as people underneath their jurisdiction. And so the Electoral College is problematic in and of itself.
And the Senate too.
To find a way to correct that.
Let me ask a final question, and then you can give a closing statement. I wanted to just talk then about ranked choice or tiered voting, where you could have a first, second, third choice. Are you in support of that versus this first past the pillar system that we have now? Because in that way, you could develop third parties and alternate candidates.
From what I've heard about ranked choice voting, it doesn't sound like a bad idea. I'll be honest, I haven't done a ton of research on it. I'm not running a campaign to necessarily I'm not doing a campaign to change the way we vote. I am doing a campaign because I want to be president, and I acknowledge this is the way we are voting. And so I'm trying to work within that system. Are there ways we can make our voting process better and more accessible and more equitable? Absolutely. But those are not the things I'm most concerned about at the moment. And this is why I'm running as an independent. And people will say, well, all you're going to do is steal votes from the Democratic nominee, and you're going to put Trump back in office. I'm adamant. I am not running a protest campaign. If I were running a protest campaign, I would have done what Bernie Sanders has done, which is I would have run as a Democrat. I could have gotten to the debates. I could have definitely raised more money. But as Bernie Sanders learned in 2016, and is probably going to learn this year, and as every other person of color who ran in this last race and every woman learned, the Democrats are not interested in nominating someone who's not a white landowning male and a Democrat. So I could have got more publicity. I could have been in the debates, but just like every other person of color, I would now be out of the race. So running as an independent is probably the most challenging, difficult way to get to the White House. But it's the only route that actually lets me get there. Running as a Democrat would almost ensure I would never get there. Running as a Republican would ensure I would never get there.
Now, Mark, I want to thank you for a great conversation. I will link to your multiple websites, including your Wikipedia and Facebook and Twitter and other pages. give you the final say if you want to wrap this conversation up.
Because right now our nation is overwhelmed by COVID-19 and the virus, and things are changing daily in how we live our lives and in even what is becoming our new normal. One of the things I've reflected on and I've realized over the past 2 weeks is that many of the emotions, many of the struggles, many of the challenges that I face or I see us facing as a nation are very similar to the emotions and the challenges I saw when I moved from Denver, Colorado back to the Navajo Nation. The feeling of intense isolation, the incredible job security, the awareness that the system isn't set up to fix or protect you, the marginalization from society and even from your neighbors. And I wrestled through those, and aside from a car accident I was in as a high school student that took the life of my brother, living on the reservation for the first 3 years, and it's where when we were in that very remote section, was probably one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. And yet all of those same feelings are what I'm experiencing and observing and seeing now is happening, not just to me, not just to my neighbors, and not even just to our country, but to the entire world. I feel like because we subjected ourselves to that experience 20 years ago, I am better prepared to help lead our nation today. One of the things that I'm very aware of is I have very little influence to change how our country responds today. I can't change the policies that President Trump is going to enact. I can't change the bills that our Congress is going to sign or going to pass. What I can do is prepare myself for where I think we're going to be in 10 months from now. In 10 months from now, I'm anticipating if we had $23 trillion in debt last week, today we have over $25 trillion in debt. I'm anticipating by January of 2021, we'll be between $30 and $35 trillion in debt. I'm anticipating we will still be in a very severe space, a very disruptive space of social distancing. I'm anticipating we will be rethinking how we educate our children with remote learning and distance learning. I'm anticipating that our economy will still be very disrupted. I'm anticipating our carbon output is going to be incredibly low because we won't be driving as much, we won't be vacationing the way we've done, we won't be filling planes and traveling as much as we did before. We won't be manufacturing at the same rate we've done before. And that's actually not bad things.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm anticipating is rather than saying, let's just get back to normal the minute we can get out of this, I mean, we are probably have a carbon output today that we've achieved in 2.5 weeks that we had projected and hoped we would be at in 50 years from now. So rather than just ramping everything back up once things are back online, what if we only ramp things up as we can do it in a green manner?
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're going to have to face a very similar cliff like the one we're facing now with COVID-19 when the environment begins to fall apart in 10 to 15 years. Mm-hmm. So to avoid that pain, let's ramp up not because we can, but let's ramp up as we invest and as we make our energies renewable and green. And so one of the things I'm convinced of, this 2020 election, the choice we are making as a country is who do we want to rebuild our economy, our society, the way we do life together. Do you want Donald Trump and his very colonial understanding? Do you want Joe Biden with his 100 years, along with the Democratic Party, of trajectory towards equality? Or do we want someone who understands the deep systemic problems we face as a nation, and began running 9 months ago with a platform to both first deconstruct and then rebuild our nation with an understanding that we the people truly means all the people. COVID-19, what's happening right now, has not changed my vision. It has not changed my policies or my platform. It's actually just removed the first step. My first step was to deconstruct these things so that we could begin to build them back up in a better, healthier, and more equitable way. Well, they're already falling apart. Now we just need to build them up again. And so I am running in the midst of a pandemic because I believe that I am going to be the best person to help our nation rebuild, to help rebuild our economy, to help rebuild our educational system, to help rebuild our healthcare, to help rebuild our society, all the things we do together. And I want to do it in a way where for the very first time, we the people might truly mean all the people.
Well, Mark Charles, I want to thank you. MarkCharles2020.com is your main website. I'll link to that and the other ones. I wish we could have gone for 8 or 10 hours. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Dan. I hope you and your listeners are doing well. I encourage everybody, please wash your hands. Make sure that you keep safe and appropriate and responsible social distancing. Call your elders. Don't hoard toilet paper, hand sanitizer, or facial masks. And above all else, walk in beauty. And then we learn how to walk in beauty together.